Her sister is brought into the ER on a gurney after 5 years of being cut off over a lie. And her father stands in the waiting room. Why is he watching?
The gurney hit the trauma bay doors, and I stepped forward. Then I saw her face. My sister.
Claire.
I'm Maya. I'm an ER attending. And the last time I spoke to my family, my parents told me I was dead to them because Claire said I'd dropped out of med school. I hadn't. I was on the dean's list. They never called to ask. They just believed her and cut me off for 5 years while I finished my degree alone, buried in loans, graduating with no one in the seats. And now she was on my gurney. I picked up her chart, stabilized my breathing. And that's when I looked up through the trauma bay window and saw my father standing in the waiting room. He saw my white coat. He saw my name badge. His face did something I had never seen it do before. And he started walking toward me. I held the door shut with one hand and told the charge nurse, Danny, to keep him in the waiting area until I finished the assessment. Danny didn't ask questions. She'd worked with me long enough to know that when my voice got that flat, something was personal. Claire was conscious, but barely. 37-degree fever, acute abdominal pain radiating to her lower right side. The paramedics had noted a rigid abdomen on arrival. I already had a strong suspicion. I ordered imaging and blood work without looking up from the chart, the same way I would for any patient on a Tuesday evening. Because that was the only way I was going to get through this. Let me explain how we got here. Not the medical part, the other part. I grew up in a house where my parents worked hard and expected the same from their kids. My father, David, was an accountant. My mother, Helen, ran a small alteration shop. They weren't wealthy, but they were consistent, and when I got into medical school, my father cried at the dinner table. That was the only time I had ever seen him cry. Claire was 3 years younger. She was the kind of person who filled rooms, loud laugh, easy smile. Always the most comfortable person in any space. We weren't close the way some sisters are, but we weren't hostile either. Or so I thought. When I started med school, Claire was applying. I didn't know the details of her applications. She never talked about it directly. I just knew she wanted to go into medicine too, and I assumed she'd get there on her own timeline. Second year was brutal. I was working weekend shifts as a hospital aide to cover rent, studying until 2 in the morning, surviving on dining hall coffee and spite. I was exhausted in a way I don't know how to describe to someone who hasn't been through it, but I was doing it. My grades were good. My attendings knew my name. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Then one November morning, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was different, not angry exactly, but closed. Like she had already made a decision and was only calling to deliver it. She said Claire had told them I wasn't in school anymore, that I had been lying for months, that I was spending the money they'd been sending, a small monthly amount, just to help with groceries, on rent for an apartment I shared with a boyfriend they didn't know about, living a life I had hidden from them. I remember standing in my scrubs in the hallway outside the hospital, my shift starting in 8 minutes, and not being able to form a sentence. I told her it wasn't true. I told her I was standing outside my hospital right now. I told her to call the registrar. I told her she could log onto the school's parent portal with the credentials I had given her a year ago. They were still valid. Nothing had changed. She said, Claire has no reason to lie about something like this, Maya. And that was the last real conversation we had for 5 years. Back in the trauma bay, the imaging results came through. Acute appendicitis, no rupture yet, but we were close. Claire needed surgery. I flagged the surgical resident on call, handed off the consult, and documented my assessment. Then I walked out of the trauma bay, through the double doors, and into the waiting room. My father was sitting in the 3rd row. He stood the moment he saw me. I stopped 6 feet away and said, She has appendicitis. Surgery is being arranged. She's stable. He nodded once. Then he said, quietly, in the voice he used when he was trying not to show something, Why didn't you just tell us the truth back then? I looked at my father for a long moment. Not because I didn't have an answer. Because I had given him the answer, 5 years ago, standing outside a hospital in scrubs, 8 minutes before a shift, and he hadn't wanted it. I said, I did. He opened his mouth. I kept going. I told Mom to call the registrar. I told her to log into the parent portal. I told her I was at the hospital when she called. I kept my voice low, the way you do in a waiting room full of strangers. She said Claire had no reason to lie. And then she stopped taking my calls. David's jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. That was almost worse than if he had. He sat back down slowly, like the air had gone out of him, and I took the seat 2 chairs away, not next to him, not across the room. I didn't know what I was doing exactly. I just knew I wasn't going to stand over him like this was a confrontation, and I wasn't going to leave because somewhere in this building my sister was being prepped for surgery, and that was still my responsibility, even if nothing else was. We sat in silence for almost a minute. Then he said, "She was so convincing, Maya." And there it was. The thing I had turned over in my head for years, the thing I had never fully understood. How 2 people who knew me, who raised me, who had watched me study for every exam since I was 8 years old, could have heard that story and not made a single phone call to verify it. "She cried," he said. "She said she'd found out from one of your friends. That you'd made her promise not to tell us, but she couldn't keep it anymore because she was worried about you." I stared at the far wall. I thought about Claire sitting at their kitchen table, performing concern. I thought about how good she was at that, at making her feelings the loudest thing in any room. I said, "Did it ever occur to you that she applied to the same program I was in?" He looked at me. "Did she tell you she applied?" I asked. "Did she tell you what happened with that?" Something shifted in his expression. Not guilt yet, more like a crack in a wall he'd been maintaining without realizing it. He said quietly, "She said she decided medicine wasn't for her." I didn't push further. I didn't know the full story yet either, not the part about the rejection, not the timeline. I just knew that something didn't add up, had never added up, and that my father was only now, sitting under fluorescent hospital lights next to the daughter he'd abandoned, beginning to feel the shape of it. The double doors swung open. Helen walked in. She saw David first, then me. Her hand went to her mouth. She crossed the room in 10 steps and reached for my arm and said, "Maya, oh, Maya, we've been so worried about Claire, she." And I said, gently but clearly, "She's in surgery. She's going to be fine." Helen's eyes filled. She said, "You're her doctor?" I was her attending, yes. I handed off to the surgical team. I paused. "It's what I do." She started crying then, and I realized she wasn't crying about Claire anymore. Or not only about Claire. I looked at my father. He was staring at his hands. "We should talk," Helen said. "When this is over, we should really talk. There's so much we didn't." "Helen." My father's voice stopped her. He said her name like a warning, or maybe like a confession. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I think I need to ask Claire something first." Claire was out of surgery within 90 minutes. Clean procedure, no complications. The surgical resident found me at the nurse's station to debrief, and I nodded through the update with the part of my brain that was still a doctor, while the rest of me sat very still behind my eyes. I walked my parents to the recovery ward myself. I don't know why. Habit, maybe. Or some version of closure I was trying to construct in real time. Claire was awake when we got there, groggy, pale, and 4 in her left arm. She looked smaller than I remembered. She turned her head toward the door, and when she saw me, something happened in her face that was not relief. It was the same thing she'd said in the trauma bay before the sedative took her under. "You're not supposed to be here." She hadn't meant the ER. She'd meant any of it, the white coat, the badge, the fact that I existed in this hospital as someone with authority and a title. I understood that now, looking at her. Helen rushed to Claire's side immediately, squeezing her hand, telling her it was over and she was safe. David stood at the foot of the bed. He was looking at Claire with an expression I had never seen on him. Not angry, not soft. Measuring. He said, "How are you feeling?" Claire said, "Awful, but better." She glanced at me. "Thanks for treating me." "I handed off before surgery," I said. "Standard protocol." A beat of silence. Helen filled it by adjusting Claire's blanket. Then David said, "Claire, when Maya was in her second year of school, you told us she dropped out." The room temperature dropped 2 degrees. Claire's eyes moved to him carefully. "Dad, I just had surgery." "I know." I'm not trying to upset you. His voice was remarkably steady. I just want to understand where that came from. Because Maya's been a practicing physician, and I'm sitting here trying to figure out what happened. Claire said, I was worried about her. I told you what I heard. From who? From a friend of hers. I don't remember the name. You don't remember the name, David repeated. Helen looked between them. David, maybe this isn't the time. What friend? He said. Not to Helen. To Claire. I stayed near the doorway. I hadn't said a word since we'd entered. I didn't need to. I watched my father do something he hadn't done 5 years ago, ask a follow-up question. Claire shifted in the bed. She said, I don't see why this matters right now. It matters, David said, because I never called the school. And I've been thinking about why I didn't. A nurse came in then, routine post-op vitals check. The conversation paused, everyone resetting into polite silence while the cuff was fastened and the numbers were read. I used the moment to step to the side table where Claire's personal effects had been placed in a labeled bag. Standard procedure after intake. Wallet, phone, keys. The bag was open from the earlier ID check. I wasn't searching. I was just standing there. But I could see into it. And sitting folded on top of everything else was a letter. Not new. The paper had that soft, worn look of something handled many times. A logo printed at the top. The same hospital system where I had done my clinical rotations. The same one where Claire had once said she thought about applying. I didn't touch it. I didn't say anything. But Helen followed my eyeline. She looked at the bag, then at Claire. And Claire, who had been watching me from the bed the whole time, said very quietly, That's private. Helen picked up the bag. Claire said, Mom, don't. Helen's hands paused. She looked at her younger daughter. Really looked, the way mothers do when they're trying to decide whether they're protecting someone or being managed by them. Then she reached into the bag and took out the letter. She unfolded it slowly. Read the header. Read the first line. The color left her face. She passed it to David without a word. He read it standing at the foot of Claire's bed. I watched his eyes move across the page. I watched him finish. I watched him read it again, not because it was complicated, but because the first time through, some part of him was still hoping he'd misunderstood. It was a rejection letter. From the medical school admissions office. Addressed to Claire.
So they just found a medical school rejection letter in Claire's hospital bag. After 5 years of blaming Maya, but why would she hide it?
Dated November 4th, and I didn't need to check my memory because I had replayed that phone call from my mother so many times over the years that I knew the date by reflex. My mother had called me on November 19th, 15 days after Claire had opened this letter. 15 days after she had been told no while I was inside the program she'd wanted. 15 days to decide what to do with that. David looked up from the letter.
He didn't look at me.
He looked at Claire. He said, This came to the house. Claire said nothing. I remember this, he said. His voice had gone very quiet. I remember there was a letter. You took it from the mail before your mother saw it. You said it was nothing. Claire's eyes were fixed on the ceiling. Her jaw was set. She had the expression of someone who had prepared for many versions of this conversation and was now realizing none of her preparations were going to hold. 3 weeks later, David said, You told us Maya had dropped out. The surgical monitor beeped steadily. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rolled past. The room itself seemed to be holding its breath. Helen sat down in the chair beside the bed. She didn't take Claire's hand this time. I stayed in the doorway. I hadn't moved. I was aware of my own heartbeat in a way I usually only notice during difficult procedures, that focused stillness that comes when something important is about to either break or hold. Claire finally looked at my father. She said, I was 23. I was devastated. I didn't know what I was doing. David said, You knew exactly what you were doing. It wasn't said with heat. That was the thing. It was said the way you say something when you've stopped arguing and started accounting, calm, flat. Final. Claire's eyes moved to me. For the first time since the trauma bay, there was something in them that looked like it might become an apology, or might just be fear wearing that shape. She said, Maya. I said, You should rest. You just had surgery. I turned and walked out of the room. I made it to the end of the corridor before I stopped. I stood next to a supply cart and pressed my back against the wall and just breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The thing I taught patients to do. Behind me, through the closed recovery room door, I could hear my father's voice, not the words, just the low, controlled weight of it. And then nothing. Then I heard my mother start to cry. Dad froze mid-step. I finished my shift. That might sound strange, that I walked back to the nurse's station, picked up the next chart, and kept working for 3 more hours after all of that. But it was the only thing that made sense to me. The ER doesn't pause for personal reckonings. There were people in pain who needed someone present, and I was still that person, regardless of what was happening 40 feet down the hall in a recovery room. It was close to midnight when David found me, at the end of the corridor near the vending machines. I had a cup of coffee. I wasn't drinking. He stopped a few feet away, not crowding me, which I noticed. He said, "She didn't deny it." I nodded. She said she was young, that she panicked, that she never thought we'd actually, he stopped. Tried again. She said she didn't think we'd cut you off completely, that she thought we'd just be angry for a while, and then call you. I looked at him. Did you believe that? He was quiet for a long moment. Then, no. That single word cost him something. I could see it. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed the rejection letter on the ledge beside me. He said, "I should have called the school the same day your mother called you. There's no version of this where that wasn't the right thing to do." He paused. "We failed you. I failed you. And I don't expect you to. I'm not here asking for anything tonight. I just needed to say it out loud, to your face." I looked at the letter. 5 years. Loans I was still paying. A graduation ceremony where I sat in the auditorium and texted my roommate photos because there was no one else to send them to. Holidays I worked because being at the hospital was easier than being nowhere. I said, "I know." Not "I forgive you." Not "it's okay." Just, "I know." Because I did. I had known for a long time that the wound existed, and now I knew its exact shape, and that was something, even if it wasn't everything. In the weeks that followed, the structure of my family rearranged itself quietly and permanently. My parents sat Claire down and told her that the monthly financial support, the apartment subsidy, the transfers that had continued without interruption through all 5 years of my absence, was ending. Not as punishment, my mother said, but because they could not keep pretending the last 5 years had been normal. Claire needed to stand on her own, and they needed to stop managing their guilt by making her comfortable. Claire didn't take it well at first. She pushed back, reframed, explained. But there was no audience for it anymore. David had stopped being persuadable by her tears, and Helen, who I think had suspected something for longer than she admitted, had gone quiet in a way that was harder to argue with than anger. Extended family found out gradually, the way things do in families, a cousin, then an aunt, then a carefully worded conversation at a birthday dinner. The version of events Claire had maintained for years, in which Maya was the difficult and distant one, had no ground left to stand on. She didn't lose everyone, but she lost the narrative, and for Claire, I think that was close to the same thing. 3 months after that night, my father showed up at the hospital on a Saturday morning. He didn't call ahead. He was holding 2 coffees from the place down the street. He'd remembered somehow that I took mine with 1 sugar, and he sat down in the lobby and waited. I came down on my break 20 minutes later. I saw him before he saw me. He was just sitting there, not on his phone, not reading anything. Just waiting. We sat together for a while. We didn't talk about Claire or the letter or the 5 years. We talked about small things, a news story he'd read, a difficult case I mentioned without details, whether the coffee was actually good or just good because it wasn't hospital coffee. When my break ended, I stood up, and he stood up with me. He said, "Same time next week?" I said, "Maybe." He nodded like that was enough. And honestly, it was not because the damage was repaired. It wasn't not yet, maybe not ever fully. But because for the first time in 5 years, I wasn't waiting for my family to see me clearly. They already had. I took the elevator back up to the ER, clipped my badge to my coat, and picked up the next chart. I had work to do.
If one wrong story from a sibling can erase 5 years of truth and silence a family completely like this in real life, Then how many people are living inside someone else's version right now?